the Graz Group's Pluraliteracies model. In this short video, we are going to explain a model developed in a project on literacies and CLIL, sponsored by the European Centre of Modern Languages of the Council of Europe. The aim of this model is to make visible and clear the relation between content knowledge and linguistic skill in students' text production, both oral and written. As teachers, we are used to reading and evaluating texts produced by our students in the content subjects. We know when a text is good and when it isn't. However, when it comes to explaining to our learners why one text is less skillful than another, we can get into difficulties. Of course, there's the language used, which may be simpler or more complex, but this cannot account for the whole of the difference. We need to look at other elements in the text, such as the structure of the text, the way ideas are linked with each other, the extent to which the text manages to get a message across in a succinct way, and most importantly for the content teacher, the understanding of the concept the text deals with and which the student demonstrates through his text. There are then several dimensions that interact in ways that need to be understood. Since we are talking about texts produced in the content subjects, a good text requires from the writer a sound understanding of the concepts explained. As schooling progresses, our students' understanding develops on two dimensions. The understanding itself becomes more sophisticated, and new and more complex concepts are added. In this way, we can say that learners' knowledge increases and deepens as they advance through schooling. It is important to be clear at this point that concept building requires more than simply knowing facts or understanding concepts. In order to understand and act like a scientist or a mathematician or geographer, as an expert in the field, learners have to develop the procedures, for example setting up an experiment, and strategies, for example careful observation of the experiment, of the subject discipline. However, as was said earlier, there is also a linguistic dimension to the knowledge expressed. Therefore, we need a second axis, a communicating continuum, that represents the way in which students communicate their understanding. Interestingly, greater skill in formulating knowledge doesn't only influence the way this knowledge and understanding is communicated, but actually leads to deeper understanding of the concept. In principle, we could now locate any text written by our students in the space created between the two axes, with a given text 1 arguably expressing more complex concepts in a less skilled way, and a text 2 expressing simpler contents in more successful ways. However, this still doesn't tell us anything about what skills mean in the terms of communicating continuum. Often, when we think about successful and unsuccessful student production, we think of it in terms of grammatical accuracy and lexical appropriacy. While both these concepts are important, they are not enough to capture the difference between a good and a weak text. Thinking of the texts our students write, we can quite easily see that some are more informal than others, so the style of the text produced will be one of the dimensions of the communicating continuum. We can also easily see that some texts feel more like a spoken text, while others are definitely written. This difference can be captured in the notion of mode, which encompasses not just speaking and writing, but may also come in other formats such as graphic, audiovisual, digital, and so on. Communication is achieved through many different channels, and especially in the content subjects, these different channels will often be used together to communicate successfully. For example, a bar graph will contain words or numbers that explain the measures on the axis, and true understanding of this graph will be expressed through language. However, there are two further dimensions that also determine the quality of the way the conceptual understanding is communicated. These are the genre and the purpose. Whenever we communicate, there is a reason or purpose for doing so. There is something we want to achieve through this act of communication. For example, we may want to inform, explain, or persuade. This motivation behind our act of communicating is called the purpose, and shapes and determines the way a certain text, in whatever mode, is structured and organized. It determines the genre of this text. Sometimes a text with a specified purpose is not successful because the genre used is not appropriate. But we may also find cases in which the genre is correct, but the different necessary stages are not kept separate, don't appear, or appear in a way that is not well constructed. For example, a definition that may become necessary as part of a science report may be given in the form of a spatial clause. The amnion is where the baby is during pregnancy, rather than the necessary structure of X is Y plus relative clause. The amnion is a thin membrane that covers the fetus during pregnancy. We now have a framework which shows us that conceptual knowledge and communication interact, and how this is reflected in communication. But what is the space between those two axes? What happens in this space? This is where learning progression can be represented. If, as we did in Graph 2, we can situate different texts at different points in this blank space between the axes, we can also represent the increase in students' ability to communicate ever more sophisticated content knowledge through different types of text here. In this way, we can represent the developmental stage of the learners by arches that unite the conceptualizing and the communicating continuum. The greater the space, the greater too the ability of students, until, as advanced students, they can express more and more advanced subject knowledge by means of different text modes in different styles, and do so in a purpose-appropriate way by using the right genres. Inside the spaces students have conquered by becoming able to cover this conceptual ground and this degree of sophistication in communicating about it, we find the typical activities of content subjects in school: doing, organizing, explaining, and arguing. Each of these represents ways of working in the content subjects and can be aligned with certain text genres that result from this activity. For example, when we do science, we act like a scientist doing an experiment, and the related genre would be a lab report. When organizing science, we organize the world or historical events scientifically, and the corresponding genre would be a description or period study in the case of the subject of history. In this way, the model visualizes the interaction between students' conceptual development and its reflection in students' text production. It should be noted that both the conceptualizing and the communicating continuum are represented by two-way arrows. This is important because mastery at the conceptual level necessarily includes and builds upon simpler facts, concepts, procedures, and strategies, while mastery of languages requires a student to be able to move back and forth between levels of sophistication, mode, and style. As teachers, we have all seen students who are able to parrot the explanation of a given concept, but struggle when asked to explain it in simpler everyday terms. Depending on the purpose of the communication, students will have to vary the style, mode, and genre they are using, and by so doing, will reveal the depth of their own understanding at the conceptual side. At the same time, the very act of communicating or articulating understanding leads to further development on the conceptual side. Conceptualizing and communicating, through whatever language and in whatever mode, can thus not be separated. Looking at the two dimensions, conceptualizing and communicating as inseparable sides in the learning process and working on them in this integrated way will lead our students to deep learning. This deep learning will allow them to develop expertise in particular domains of knowledge and the ability to transfer what is learned in one context to others. For us as teachers, it is important to remember that languaging knowledge does not only reflect understanding, but also promotes it.